Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Brandis Friedman.
And I'm Paris Schutz. On the show tonight,
104 people were shot in Chicago on the 4th of July weekend.
Senator Dick Durbin is here to talk about the gun violence, voting rights, infrastructure, and many more things on the agenda in Washington.
This is my 8th day, and I'm announcing a $9.3 billion budget.
Chicago Public Schools preps for students to come back to the classroom in the fall with a new and bigger budget.
People are hurting right now in Cuba.
Unprecedented protests in Cuba amid a significant economic crisis. What the demonstrations mean for the island and U.S.-Cuba relations.
Inflation is on the rise, including a 45% increase in gas prices over the past 12 months. What that means for the economy.
As riders complain of long waits and high rideshare prices, taxi drivers hope to lure them back.
City Council members will begin redrawing Chicago's ward boundaries later this month. What impact could the final maps have?
And a local musician brings a Peruvian beat to his jazz band. But first, some of today's top stories. Police Superintendent David Brown opens up to Chicago reporters about his meeting with President Joe Biden and U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland. Brown was part of a roundtable on gun violence yesterday and says he had, quote, significant and substantive discussions about strategies to reduce surging violent crime in the city. Brown says the Chicago Police Department will soon be rolling out a new strike force. That's a collaboration with the U.S. Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, aimed at tracing illegal guns and investigating the buyers and sellers of those guns.
The president did a lot of listening. I know that seems like a trivial thing, but he really listened, and he was honest about what he wanted to focus on. In addition to listening, being open and honest.
And we'll have U.S. Senator Dick Durbin's response to national efforts to curb violence in just a moment. More turnover at the top of Mayor Lori Lightfoot's administration. 2 department heads announced they are retiring. They are Rosa Escareño, head of the Department of Business and Consumer Affairs, and Mark Kelly, the Cultural Affairs and Special Events Commissioner. Lightfoot praised Escareño and Kelly's tenures, saying that their work has made the city a better place. Both Escareño and Kelly were appointed under former Mayor Rahm Emanuel. The president gives an impassioned speech on voting rights. This as 2 voting rights bills, filibuster changes, and infrastructure proposals are all on the table in the Senate with only a few weeks to go before the August recess. Joining us to talk about all that and more is Illinois Senior Senator Dick Durbin. Senator Durbin, welcome to Chicago Tonight as always. I want to start with Texas lawmakers, Democrats specifically. They are on the lam from their state to prevent that legislature from voting on restrictions, from passing voting restrictions. Meanwhile, President Biden is also turning up the national debate on a voting rights speech that he gave today in Philadelphia. Take a look.
There's an unfolding assault taking place in America today, an attempt to suppress and subvert the right to vote and fair and free elections. An assault on democracy.
Senator Durbin, 2 bills, voting rights bills in the Senate that would counter what the president says is an assault on democracy. Do they have any chance of going anywhere?
No. At this point, there's no indication the Republicans will support either one. Let's face it, the demographics are not on the side of the Republican Party. The only way that they can engineer victories in the future is by districts drawn carefully, and secondly, by suppressing the vote of those who are going to vote against them. And that's what they set out to do. If it were a random state here or there, you'd say there's no pattern. But there is a pattern. There's over 20 states where Republicans dominate the legislature, where they're finding ways to reduce the opportunity for people who are eligible, reduce the opportunity for them to vote. That is a conscious design, and I'm very sorry to see it happen.
And when you say no, it seems to indicate to me that you don't believe that Senator Joe Manchin, Senator Kristen Sinema will change their stance on the filibuster, which would eliminate the need for 10 Republican votes.
Well, they're not the only ones. They've stated it clearly and publicly where they stand. I think I understand where they are. There are other senators who have misgivings too, and many are saying, all right, fine, if I'm for eliminating the filibuster, what then is the Senate all about, and how will the rules work? you really have to sit down and write a rules book or create a rules committee like the House. It just doesn't end overnight without complications.
Sounds like you think that would be a slippery slope then.
Well, it's a challenge. I will tell you, I'm as frustrated as anybody. 20 years ago, I introduced the DREAM Act. Most people know what that's all about. Young people brought to this country, a chance for them to become American citizens. I've lost it on the floor of the Senate 5 times to the filibuster. So I know what the filibuster is all about, and I know that issues like immigration and civil rights and human rights turn out to be the major topics and major targets.
So if the Senate isn't going to take up these bills, is there any other action that can be taken to assuage the nerves of Democrats at watching some of these state legislatures pass voter restrictions?
No, and I will tell you, the Supreme Court a week or two ago in their Brnovich decision reiterated the fact that they have a very expansive view. Justice Alito wrote the opinion, an expansive view when it comes to limitations on voting. And I just think they're flat out wrong and reflects a very conservative court and one that may reflect today's Republican Party.
Speaking of the court, Senator, you are chairman of the Judiciary Committee. There's been some talk about Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer. He is one of the 3 liberal members of the court. Do you believe he should retire in the next year, given that Democrats have the Senate and they would be able to perhaps confirm a replacement short of the midterms?
The last thing you're going to get me quoted on is pressuring Stephen Breyer to retire. I am not going to do that. I want him to make up his own mind, and I think outside pressure is counterproductive.
All right, let's move on to other policy. The president had touted a bipartisan agreement on about $1 trillion infrastructure package. It seems like some of the GOP support right now is wavering. What is the status of that right now?
I just talked to one of my colleagues who is sitting in on the actual sessions where they're writing the bill, and he feels very positive that it's going to be done. And a lot of the questions that are being raised about Republicans not sticking with the bill and for a variety of reasons, he said he hasn't heard any of that. So I think that may be manufactured. At this point, I believe there are at least 10, maybe more now, Republicans willing to join Democrats in a good, strong bipartisan infrastructure bill.
And do you think some of the specifics of that agreement might change? I mean, it was about $1 trillion, give or take, the last we heard. No tax increases on higher earners, as the president had wanted, either for that or and some of the human infrastructure bills that he wanted. So what might change about the bill to get it past the finish line?
So here are the 3 things to recall. The Biden infrastructure bill was much larger, but virtually every item that is now in the bipartisan bill was part of the Biden bill. So the White House approved that. Secondly, the mechanism to pay for it has been agreed to by the Republicans and by the Democrats with the White House. And third, I think there are a lot of people, particularly a dozen Republicans, who would like to see bipartisan measures passing in the Senate. I would agree with that goal.
The minority leader, Mitch McConnell, has said he doesn't want to exactly help along the Biden agenda. Do you think he would be a roadblock to keeping some of these Republican senators on board?
Harris, you understated his position dramatically. He said he was 100% opposed to the Biden agenda. He comes to the floor every day begging Republicans not to vote with Joe Biden on anything. It's the same thing he did to Barack Obama, where he said, I want him to be a one-term president. But there are some Republicans who believe that just showing up here and voting no on everything is not a very good way to get this country moving again. I hope they'll stick with it and join us in a bipartisan effort.
All right, let's move on to this summit on violence that the president had yesterday that featured Chicago Police Superintendent David Brown. Let's hear what David Brown said about it.
Programs with young people, jobs, street outreach, violence interrupters. I mean, the whole ecosystem, not just the enforcement piece. That's one part of it. I mean, the most dangerous people need to be taken off the streets. That's clearly our focus from a law enforcement perspective. But there's an ecosystem here that we all have to focus on. This is not going to be a mass incarceration effort. We know that didn't work.
So, Senator, President Biden and Attorney General Merrick Garland have talked about increased assistance for violence in the form of joint federal and local strike forces to go after illegal gun dealers. Is there anything different about this plan that hasn't been proposed by past attorneys generals and presidents?
Here's the difference. The difference is the Congress, through the American Rescue Plan of President Biden, without a single Republican voting in favor of it in the House or the Senate, has sent dramatic amounts of money to the states and local units of government. And what Joe Biden said yesterday is, I hope that you'll consider taking a portion of that and spending it on what the superintendent just described, not just the tools of law enforcement, but also community intervention, crisis intervention in the lives of young people. The things that we know get to the heart of why someone joins a gang and shoots an innocent person. That, I think, is a realistic approach because we've sent the resources to the local level to make it work.
And that's something that City Council has been debating. But on the gun part, I mean, can the Justice Department go after illegal gun sales more forcefully than previous Justice Departments have?
The President has said he wants that to happen. I hope he can make it happen because I just want to be very candid with you. There is no meaningful gun legislation that's going to pass in the United States Senate. It's a 50-50 Senate. We know where both parties are aligned, and I don't see any change in the offing.
Speaking about safety and violence, we hear that the fencing has come down around the Capitol for the first time in 6 months after the January 6th insurrection. How are you feeling about your safety and the safety of lawmakers and staff members at the Capitol?
I feel good about it, and I will tell you, I think most members of Congress do too. What a sad day that was on January 6th. That was a day from a congressional viewpoint that will live in infamy in terms of what that Trump-inspired insurrectionist mob did to us in the United States Capitol. Hundreds of them have now been charged with crimes. Thank goodness. They ought to be held accountable for what they did on that day. In terms of what they'll do in the future, I wish we'd put together the bipartisan commission that Pelosi and Schumer suggested, but McConnell's against it. I'd like to get to the bottom of what these white supremacy and nationalist groups had to do with financing and planning January 6th.
And presumably that's part of what the FBI is investigating as well. I want to get to some local state politics. The FEC just put out a ruling today regarding Congresswoman Robin Kelly. She's a person that you were instrumental in getting to replace Mike Madigan as chairperson of the Illinois Democratic Party. But the FEC is now saying because she's a federal office holder, she cannot be involved in any fundraising for state or local races. Does that hamper her ability to lead the party, since that's a big function of the job?
Well, I want to read the FEC opinion because we made an offer to them on her behalf that she would not be involved in state and local fundraising, that she would confine any of her fundraising to the federal side. And let me just add quickly, for all of the pluses of Chairman Madigan, he did not really dole out money beyond his own Illinois House when it came to campaigns to a great extent. So we think if we can work with Robin and the FEC, that she can play the role we want her to play as a spokesman for our party, but also we can find fundraising opportunities that totally comply with the law.
And as I understand, that ruling is saying that the party has to form a special independent committee to do that kind of fundraising, which I think is some of the things that you were proposing.
That's exactly what we proposed. And let me tell you, that is not an outlandish approach. I've been involved in fundraising at many different levels, and I've been confined in my fundraising by the same federal laws that guided their decision. And there's just a limit to what we can do. But I know that Robin wants to be compliant with the law, and she took the case to the FEC to get a ruling to base her own administration on.
All right, Senator Dick Durbin, we thank you as always for joining us.
Thank you, too.
And now, Brandis, we toss it back to you.
Paris, thank you. Chicago Public Schools is on the path to a bigger budget, but is it better? Amanda Venicky joins us now with details on this spending plan as CPS prepares to completely return to in-classroom learning this fall for the first time since the pandemic hit. Amanda, what's in this budget?
Brandis, this is a budget that spends $9.3 billion, and it does come at a time of transition for CPS. There's that return to in-school learning, but also turnover up top. A search is on for a permanent CEO. Meanwhile, it is interim schools chief Jose Torres who's charged with introducing and getting past a budget plan before the next school year. He's only been on the job 8 days.
This budget provides critical resources that will support our students and families as they engage from an unprecedented time and begin the journey toward healing.
The plan calls for spending $130 million on school reopening, vaccine efforts, technology, PPE, and re-engagement. Also, $100 million on improving air quality systems. Plus, there's funding to expand early childhood and all-day kindergarten.
And will fund such initiatives as a CPS tutor corps, which includes hiring and training 850 literacy and math tutors, behavior and mental health teams in every school, upgraded technology to help staff and students access Skyline, our new universal curriculum. In keeping with our commitment to equity, schools that need more will get more.
Equity, really a big deal. And then also, speaking of hiring,
we have record high staffing levels for nurses, social workers, and special education case managers, and we have expanded opportunities and resources for our diverse learners.
Now, this budget spends roughly $1 billion more than the current one, and that is not, by the way, due to a sizable property tax hike that is paid for by Chicago residents. The Civic Federation's Lawrence Massal says, actually, lately is when in July you have CPS announcing a fiscal crisis, but not this time.
Have got the best financial outlook that they've had in a long time. They have the largest amount of reserves that they've had. They had to borrow much less than they have in previous years. They even are holding back on some of their federal COVID relief money for more than the current year. So they're not spending everything the minute it comes in. So it's a pretty good Christmas present, the Chicago Public School budget this year.
But that gift does not have a long shelf life, he says. That extra $1 billion in spending really possible because of that federal COVID relief money. CPS will have about $1.8 billion left to spend next year, but that money isn't going to keep coming forever. On top of that, CPS has other concerns. Property tax bill delays could create fiscal pressures, Massal says, and Chicago's population is declining. School enrollment is down.
It's not going to be enough to, get them out of the woods long term unless they get some very significant structural relief on the pensions and they address the disparity between a declining student population and a growing administrative cost.
I also spoke this afternoon with CTU's Vice President Stacey Davis Gates, whose initial reaction was also twofold. Of course, appreciating this opportunity, as she called it, of an unprecedented amount of money, but that was mixed with caution and a caveat. It comes after what she says is a long period of Chicago disinvesting, not spending enough money on schools. Also, she says all those extra counselors and nurses still may not be enough.
And that while we are happy to receive this, we still need to set benchmarks that reflect the needs of our school community. And then we also must begin the process of making these investments sustainable over time.
She says with CPS plus the city's COVID relief money, the Lightfoot administration should spend more to ensure that students aren't just recovering from COVID at school. Also, she says they need to do more. So, for example, CPS families without homes, they need housing support. Davis Gates also asking for more specifics on spending.
It's not enough to send a press release. It is enough to show benchmarks. For instance, we're going to need benchmarks with respect to how this money is spent, how it is impacting our school communities. We need depth of understanding. We need widespread stakeholder input.
Now, the CTU and CPS, again, with that board still for now appointed by the mayor, they are still in talks on a return to school plan for fall and what that will look like. The union proposing a goal of 80% of students eligible to be vaccinated for COVID to have received that shot by October. Also, they want telework accommodations for union members who are the primary caregivers for at-risk individuals who haven't had the vaccine. Also, a ban on instructors having to teach students who are in person and virtual students at the same time. Now, as for the budget, it is just a proposal for now. The board is set to vote on it at its next meeting, the end of this month, July 28th. Brandis, back to you.
Amanda, thank you. Since this spring, rideshare users have complained of high surge prices and longer waits, a product of increased demand and fewer drivers on the road. Uber and Lyft say they've added thousands of drivers in recent weeks, leading to a drop in wait times and surge pricing. But many passengers are still unhappy, and some are turning to taxis. It's an industry hit hard by the popularity of rideshare and by COVID-19. As the pandemic eases, how are taxi drivers doing, and are they trying to lure back riders? Joining us to talk about that are Fayez Kozendar, Executive Director of the United Transporters Community Council, Furqan Mohammed, a taxi industry attorney, and Jason Gross, Vice President of Mobile at the taxi hailing app Curb. Gentlemen, thanks to all of you for joining us. Furqan, let's start with you, please. We know that the pandemic has been especially hard on essential workers. What's it been like for taxi drivers?
So it's been very, very tough. And the reason for that is I think most people forget that the taxi industry already went through a reckoning of some sort about 5 or 6 years ago when the TNP, Uber and Lyft companies and other transportation network providers came into the city and started competing with the taxi industry. And we saw a steep decline in the medallion values that a lot of these cab drivers had, where we saw values from $350,000 down to about $25,000 in March 2020. So on the heels of that, we were finally starting to see some stability, and then March 2020 rolled around and just the industry took another steep decline from there.
Pretty significant drop there. Fayez Kozendar, are drivers and passengers, are they starting to return?
I believe so. Our members always communicate with us and tell us that customers are abandoning and seeking taxi drivers at both airports. I have Hamid Ammar from Midway always calling me and telling me customer waiting over 1 hour to get taxis, and they are seeking the city to have more help starters at night, especially at night shift, to help facilitate the customers to get cabs to their destinations. Furthermore, O'Hare last year used to be waiting time over 4 hours, 5 hours. Sometimes there's no activities at the airports, but now there's more than half of the lot is full and people waiting down the terminal for taxi rides.
Waiting for taxis there.
Yes, seeking taxi, and they want reliable transportation, which is taxi cab on the curb.
And Jason Gross, taxi app Curb, the name of the app, is rolling out a new feature. Passengers will be able to see their full fare up front. Tell us about that, please.
Sure. So one of the things we've seen over the last year since the ride-sharing companies went public, and certainly exacerbated by the pandemic, is, as you mentioned, the rideshare prices have really gone through the roof, and the wait times have also increased. And one of the things that people are unaware of is that taxis have become cheaper. But what's more difficult is, they've been able to go nowhere to see, hey, what is the price for this taxi ride going to be? People are on their mobile phones, they want to compare their options. So what we've done is we took the historical taxi meter data, we take the time and the distance from someone's pickup to the drop off, and we give them a fixed price up front. And we also offer that fixed price to the driver so people can really compare and understand in the moment that this is a cheaper alternative. And as my friend mentioned, these are professional taxi drivers. They know the way around town. They're fully licensed, fully regulated. Taxi is oftentimes a more desirable form of transportation, but it's been our job to make it easier for people to hail a cab from anywhere in the city and to understand what they're going to pay in advance, and that it is in fact cheaper, sometimes as much as 50% cheaper than the TNPs.
And Furqan Mohammed, do you think more riders will turn to taxis because of the surge in rideshare prices?
I certainly think so. I think it's a great step in the right direction. But at the end of the day, long term, I see this being a short-term boost rather than a industry fix necessarily. At the end of the day, you're not seeing a lot of new cab drivers coming into the industry. you're not seeing medallion values increase in price. You're seeing them decrease. They've actually decreased 50% more since March 2020, after already dropping about 85% of their value since 2013 or so. So, I mean, it's going to be a long road to recovery. I think the Curb app is definitely a great first step in the direction of recovery.
Fayez, are there other steps that Uber and Lyft could take that would, other steps that Uber and Lyft have done, that the taxi industry could also adopt?
Well, Uber and Lyft now seeking more drivers, and they want to pay them $35 an hour. But who's going to pay for that? The customers. I have a bill, I have a receipt. Jane Commando, she is a director of Crossroad Fund, gave me a bill from a ride from Rajas Park to Prudential Plaza, and the receipt says $360 for Uber ride. Who's going to afford that? Now, the taxi industry must come to terms with the demand, meaning that they have to provide for easy booking, easy pay for the customers so they can come back to a reliable transportation mean in the city of Chicago, which is taxi cab for conventioneers and for tourists.
And
other than that, all this work about the apps, there must be one app in the city, there must be one color in the city, so the industry will come back and the medallion will come back.
To that end, before we run out of time, sorry, Fayez, what role can the city play?
The city must come up with a solution, because they are on the sideline for many, many years, seeing that the industry going downhill and losing, the medallion losing its value, because the city did not do its leadership role, which is dictating to these companies that, okay, all of you must come to a solution. One central dispatch system. That's what we called for when we established UTCC in January 2008, calling for central dispatch system. If the city and the companies come up with this solution, we'll have no problem, and we'll have no Uber or Lyft even.
And before we run out of time, Jason, I wanted to ask you, are you optimistic about the future of the taxi industry?
I am.
For the first.
Sorry, Jason, go ahead.
Sorry.
Sure. More so than I have been in a while. I think what Curb is designed to do is be effectively a universal app for taxis across the city and across the country. We work with the regulators in tandem, and we'll support what they do. But in the meantime, we're providing an application, we're providing in taxi systems, we're enabling all the taxi drivers who do want to be part of one centralized app to work with Curb. And over the last 3 months, we've seen a 500% increase in bookings through the Curb app. So we really are optimistic, and certainly can't control the future, but we can do our best to help move it in the direction of taxi.
And that's where we'll have to leave it. My thanks to Fayez Kozendar, Jason Gross, and Furqan Mohammed for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Up next, adding South American rhythms to a modern jazz combo. Stay with us.
It really is about community, where we all come together.
Chicago needs to make space for everyone.
And there's much more ahead on the program, including a look at the economy as gas prices soar. But first, a Chicago-based musician with Peruvian roots plays a traditional instrument in a modern jazz setting. How many drummers do you know that actually play the seat that they're sitting on? Producer Mark Vitale met a local percussionist who imports South American rhythms to the Northern Hemisphere.
Juan Pastor switches from his drum kit to the cajon in mid-song.
This is the cajon. It's an Afro-Peruvian instrument that I grew up playing. Most Peruvian people know what a cajon is because a lot of them are just in houses. It's kind of a popular thing now to, even for musicians, for people that are not musicians, to have still a cajon. in their home. It's a simple instrument and it's used for most of the Afro-Peruvian dances.
Juan Pastor grew up in the capital city of Lima.
Like the first 20 years of my life, I learned a lot of focusing on Peruvian percussion instruments, how to transfer some of those sounds onto the drum set. So what happens is that you have a lot of people from different countries like hanging out sometimes in clubs in Miraflores, that's where I'm from. A lot of these clubs have like jazz, but why do I say jazz? Because it's not like the straight ahead jazz that you'll find maybe in the US when you go to a jazz club. It's more like already some kind of fusion between Peruvian folkloric music. It could be from the Afro-Peruvian culture, it could be from the Andes. The good thing about Lima is that it's kind of always doing their own thing, which is really cool. That Peruvian music is constantly evolving right now.
He left Peru to study at Northern Illinois and DePaul, and he founded a band, Chinchano.
Chinchano is my tribute, creating my music. It's that influence, it's who I am now as a person who grew up in Peru and later on developed a music career in the States.
Pastor is also an in-demand player who's worked with Kurt Elling and Micaiah McCraven. Music runs in the family.
My mother, she's a folkloric Peruvian singer, and my father as well, he's a musician, a bass player, guitar player. One of the main reasons also I do music is having music in the house, not necessarily like, hey, learn this, just like performing in an everyday, like hearing music.
After 13 years in the Chicago region and student visas, work visas, and artist visas, he is still trying to get his green card.
It's amazing that it's still very hard for somebody who, let's say, have been doing the right things in terms of getting paperwork. It's still a long process. And even after showing all these things, the green card process will ask me for lots of evidence, like things like you have to have a Grammy. So far, I haven't get the Grammy yet. Hopefully this next album will cut it. While I love being in Peru and being close to my family, Chicago, I could say, is my home.
For Chicago Tonight, this is Mark Vitale.
Sadly, Juan Pastor just returned from Lima, Peru to attend the funeral of his father, Carlos Pastor. He asked that we dedicate tonight's story to his memory. And Pastor is working on a new album. His band Chinchano just announced 2 shows next month at Fourth Presbyterian Church and the Epiphany Center for the Arts. You can find out more on our website. And still to come on Chicago Tonight, older people are set to start redrawing Chicago's ward boundaries later this month, but there's controversy surrounding the process. Inflation is on the rise with a more than 5% increase over the past 12 months, driven in part by the surge in home prices. What does this all mean for your pocketbook? And amid unprecedented protests in Cuba, some are calling on the U.S. to lift its embargo on the country. What the demonstrations mean for the island. But first, some more of today's top stories. Rising COVID rates in 2 states means the reinstatement of a partial travel ban in Chicago. Missouri and Arkansas become the first states to be added to the ban in over a month. It's due to rising cases in both of those states driven by the more aggressive Delta variant. Unvaccinated visitors to Chicago from those states are urged to quarantine for 10 days or record a negative test within 72 hours of arrival, so say officials. A Chicago banker is convicted for trying to bribe the Trump administration for a job. Stephen Kalk, who is seen here on Chicago Tonight in 2011, is a former CEO of Federal Savings Bank here in Chicago. He's convicted of authorizing $16 million in loans to convicted former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort in an effort to get a job in the Trump administration. Kalk reportedly did meet with the Trump transition team but was never offered a job. Kalk's lawyer said they will appeal today's ruling. And now to Brandis and details on Chicago's remap process. Brandis.
Paris, thank you. It's official. City Council members will start remapping Chicago's ward boundaries later this month, and the result could shape city politics for the next decade. WTTW News reporter Heather Sharon joins us now with more. Welcome back, Heather. So what dates do we need to be on the lookout for as this remapping process begins?
Well, the first date to remember is July 26th. On that date, aldermen will head to a back room, which will be known as the map room, where they'll be able to use special mapping software to start the process. After that, the next date to know is August 16th, when we are finally supposed to get a look at data from the 2020 census. And then they have until December 1st to find a map that at least 41 aldermen can agree on.
Now, why start the process before those census numbers are released?
Well, it's because time is of the essence, and this is going to be a very contentious and difficult process, because while in Chicago the issue isn't really Democrats versus Republicans, the issue is really race in a city that is almost split into thirds between white Chicagoans, black Chicagoans, and Latino Chicagoans, and they're all jockeying for power on the city council, where it's a zero-sum game. If there's a majority black ward, that might come at the expense of a majority Latino ward, which is what happened in 2011, and bad feelings still linger about that.
Now, not everybody seems happy, as you just said, about this remapping process. What's at the center of the debate there?
Well, the issue is whether there will be enough wards that will maintain a base of African-American power in Chicago. The black population in Chicago has been dropping precipitously for most of the past decade, and a lot of black aldermen are concerned that they will see their power reduced significantly, while at the same time, Latino politicians see this census and this remapping as a chance to really seize the power that they were denied 10 years ago. And everybody wants to make sure that their ward doesn't get redrawn in a way that they won't be able to win re-election in 2023, which is when these maps are supposed to take effect.
What it all comes down to. Heather Sharon keeping an eye on it for us. Thanks, Heather.
Thanks, Brandis.
And you can read Heather's full story on our website. That's WTTW.com/news. And now, Paris, we go back to you.
And Brandis, it's not just rideshare that's more expensive right now. You may have noticed the dollar isn't buying quite as much of a lot of things as it used to. The Bureau of Labor Statistics says the overall level of inflation is 5.4%, well above analysts' estimates and the Federal Reserve's target of around 2%. Some of that is driven by temporary factors related to the pandemic, such as a 45% rise in used car prices, but other factors may not be so temporary. So what do these inflationary pressures mean for the economy and your wallet going forward? Joining us to help us unpack all of this are Ed Stewart, Emeritus Professor of Economics at Northeastern Illinois University, Luigi Zingales, Professor of Entrepreneurship and Finance at University of Chicago Booth School of Business, and Rachel Gressler, Research Fellow on Economics, Budget, and Entitlements at the Heritage Foundation. Welcome all of you to Chicago Tonight.
Good evening, Paris.
Good to see you. So let's go through some of these costs. Inflation, as we mentioned, up 5.4%. Gas up 45% over the last year. Used cars 45% as well, 10% in the last month alone. Dining out 4.2%. Food 2.4%. Ed Stewart, what are the culprits here?
I think one of the phrases I use to explain this is bounce back inflation. Like you've already said, not only are used car prices up, but airline fares are up 24.6%. Hotels are up 16.9%. These were sectors of the economy where there was deflation during the pandemic, and now with the vaccination effort semi-successful and people with some money in their pockets because of stimulus and savings during the pandemic, demand is going faster than supply, and you're getting what I think is going to be temporary inflation.
And so you're saying temporary inflation. Economists at the Fed have said temporary inflation. Luigi Zingales, how long is temporary, and do you believe that?
So certainly there is a temporary component, but let's do this quick calculation. If prices were not to rise from now to the end of the year, we will already be at 3.6%. If prices were just to rise the same level for the rest of the year, we're doubling to 7.3%. So we're way above anything that anybody has expected at the beginning of the year, anybody that at the Fed has expected, even anticipating this bottleneck. So I think that there is a concern. The concern is not as large as to say we should act now. But what I am afraid is of the fact that the Fed does not seem to be afraid. In fact, paraphrasing Roosevelt, I would say that the only thing to fear is the lack of fear itself.
The lack of fear from the Fed. So you're saying you don't think the Fed is taking it seriously and they're not going to take action, or at least it doesn't seem like they are. Rachel Greszler, at what point do you think the Fed does have to step in here and attack some of these inflationary pressures or government policy? When should they step in?
Yeah, well, and I think that government policy should have stepped out of the way quite a while ago, because I think that there's this artificial bounce back component also, and that has been spurred on by 3 rounds of stimulus checks, supersized unemployment benefits that are now available a year and a half after the pandemic began. And so it's no wonder when you have the federal government simultaneously increasing demand by pumping this money into the economy and then restricting the supply of available workers to meet that demand by offering these supersized unemployment insurance benefits. You know, it's not rocket science here to see how that is weighing on prices. And that could continue beyond just the short term if we see these policies go beyond the pandemic. And we're already talking about $3 to $6 trillion in so-called infrastructure projects. Employers are already having to compete to get the workers they need. They don't need a jobs package creating millions more new jobs when we already have a record high number of job openings out there.
And especially, Ed Stewart, in the hospitality industry, the restaurant industry, we've talked to so many people that cannot find workers. So it's this weird situation where there are inflationary pressures and many, many jobs open that are not being filled. What's going to change that situation?
Well, what's going to change it is basic economics, supply and demand. Wages are much too low. Employers have been used to getting employees at rock bottom prices and not paying benefits and having irregular schedules. And power, fortunately, is being shifted, at least in part, to the labor supply side, to workers, and they have a little bit more bargaining power now. And what's going to happen is that employers are going to have to start paying fair wages and treating employees like human beings, which they haven't done, especially in leisure and hospitality, for a long time. So I think this labor shortage is a good thing.
Well, so Ed, you're saying the wages are the problem. Rachel, you're saying the extended unemployment benefits. Luigi Zingales, where do you fall on this? So why is there such a labor shortage? Is it all the above?
I think it's all of the above. I think there is no doubt that unemployment benefits allow people to look harder for the best job, and so they take longer to go back to the workforce. It's also true that there is still a lot of disruption because a lot of schools are not in full swing. So childcare is a huge issue, and so a lot of people cannot provide a full amount of job of labor they want because they have to stay home with the kids. And I think that what Ed is saying is certainly true that this helps raising wages, but if the wage raise in nominal terms less than inflation, at the end of the day, workers are worse off, not better off. So, and in the last couple of months, what we have seen is very high increase in prices and not equal increase in wages.
And I think that's to the point. We all would like to see rising wages, and we want, especially at the lower end, for those individuals to have that upward mobility and a chance to climb that ladder of opportunity. But you have to face the other side of that. And the reality is that higher wages lead to higher prices. Things like the cost of childcare, if that's weighing on the recovery, higher wages for childcare workers equals higher costs for childcare for families. And I did an estimate just of the $15 minimum wage, and that increasing childcare costs by 21%. We're talking about over $3,000 more for an average family with 2 kids. And so there are both sides of the equation here going forward.
And Rachel Greszler, you know, you kind of alluded to this in the last year, about $5 trillion in government stimulus spending to kind of prop the economy up. What happens when that starts to peter out and the economy just kind of has to surge forward on its own?
Right. And so talking about over $40,000 per household that has been spent over this past year, but that's all deficit finance spending. That's got to come out of somewhere in the future. And so while now the federal government is helping to stimulate the economy, it's going to have to pare that back going forward. And already we have the factor of potentially higher inflation that could lead to higher interest rates. And then the Federal Reserve increasing interest rates where you need the higher costs on the deficit and you get this downward spiral. So there are significant risks out there.
All right, Luigi Zingales, you're afraid here that the Fed is just not going to act. At what point do you think the Fed has to start thinking about acting?
So I think that the next few months will be crucial because I think there is a lot of truth in what Ed said, that there are temporary elements in this rise. But if we see that this is continuing for a couple of months longer, and if we see that this starts to be embedded in the expectation of economic operators, I think that the Fed should intervene. My fear is that I don't see the Fed so attentive of this. They seem to be relaxed. They, in fact, moved to a target of 2% over a long period of time. And because we undershot inflation for a while, there are plenty of room to overshoot inflation for a while. And politically, I see a huge demand for inflation because that would reduce the debt of students, reduce even the government debt in real terms. So I see a lot of pressure for inflation to go around to be contained.
All right, some of the upsides of the current inflation situation. Our thanks right now to Edward Stewart, Luigi Zingales, and Rachel Greszler. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And up next, what's behind the unprecedented protests in Cuba? But first, we take a look at the weather.
The island nation of Cuba has seen unprecedented demonstrations amid the country's worst economic crisis in decades and nearly 60 years into the United States' embargo on the nation. Meanwhile, President Joe Biden says he supports Cuban citizens in the wake of anti-government protests across the island. Joining us to discuss those protests and the state of U.S.-Cuba relations are Maria de los Angeles Torres, a professor of Latin American and Latino Studies at the University of Illinois Chicago and a native of Cuba. Eric Torres of the Chicago Coalition in Solidarity with Latin America and who is of Cuban descent. And Alberto Cole, a professor at DePaul University's College of Law. He has a background in U.S. foreign policy and U.S. relations with Cuba, and Professor Cole is also a Cuban native. Thanks to all three of you for joining us. Alberto Cole, let's start with you, please. What is your reaction to some of the protests that we have been seeing in Cuba, which are extremely rare?
I think what we're seeing is a combination of things. Number one, the Cuban government is in bad shape because of COVID, because of the deterioration in the economy, some of which has to do with the Trump sanctions, but also a lot of which has to do with its own economic mismanagement and incompetence. And then thirdly, there's a whole new generation in Cuba today, people under the age of 40 who want to change things. They don't like the fact that in Cuba there is only one political party. They don't like the fact that political activity and dissent are restrained. And they have taken advantage of the gradual spread of social media technologies to begin expressing their disagreements with the government's policy. And so you have seen all this come together in this very spontaneous outburst of protests throughout the island. One of the sad things about Cuba today, by the way, is that a large majority of the younger generation, people under 35, want to leave the country. And that includes people who are children of high party officials, senior government officials, and they want to leave Cuba because they don't see hope for themselves in the island.
And
that's
Maria,
a serious problem for a country.
I want to get Maria in here. Briefly, we've heard a bit of this just now from Alberto, but remind us what has led us up to this point to these protests.
Well, I mean, I think that I agree with Alberto. I think that there are multiple factors going on. I would say it's not just an economic crisis. I would say it's a political crisis as well. And that political crisis, we can date it way back at the beginning of the revolution, the promise of social justice and democracy. The social justice was delivered in some ways, the democracy was not. And so this has been accumulation, I think, of a political crisis throughout the time. But most immediately this spring, the Communist Party held its Congress. And at that Congress, very little was changed. And I think that the last little hope that Many of the economists, for instance, that we're in contact with, that we have exchanges, academic exchanges, had asked for some really simple things, like, for instance, professional licenses for architects. And so the Communist Party decided not to do that. On the other hand, they're allowing foreign investors to come in. There is an elite that makes a lot of money. There is a lot of corruption in Cuba. But that, on the other hand, the constitution that was ratified some time ago makes it illegal for Cubans, on the island to invest.
And Eric, I wanted to talk about the pandemic as well, because Eric Torres, how has the coronavirus pandemic impacted the situation in Cuba?
Well, it has had a strong impact, in the sense that they don't have enough syringes to properly inoculate, their people, to vaccinate their people against COVID. They have their own vaccine that they've created. In fact, they have 6 different types that they have created. One of them has already been approved by the world bodies that are in charge of approving those things. Problem is they have a severe shortage of the syringes, and there's still quite a few people that still need to be vaccinated. They've had almost 7,000 new cases of COVID recently in the last few days. The problem is that they are being they're under this blockade, but from the United States, that's keeping them from getting proper materials for making the medicines and the vaccine and the syringes, and food and other important supplies, fuel for creating electricity, for example. It's very vital that you have electricity to be able to administer your services. So people are understandably upset because they haven't been able to get those things.
Right. And Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel blames the U.S. embargo for the economic situation and the shortages. Maria, is this a key concern for Cubans right now?
I have not seen any of the protesters in Cuba saying that they want an end to the embargo. I think the embargo, obviously, it's there. There's certain impact, but I think that it would be misreading the situation in Cuba to think that that is the problem, and that at least the way that people on the streets are articulating it. They're articulating it as a political problem, as a domestic problem, and the Cuban government does have options. I mean, there are, even with the embargo, there are options. You can go on a listening tour, or you can go on a shooting tour, when you have protesters. There is a lot of concern about violence. The one thing that I really would like to say is that I think it would be wrongheaded to encourage a military intervention on the part of the United States. And there is a plurality of voices in Miami. Some are asking for that, including Marco Rubio, but many, many more are not asking for that. I do think that the Biden administration needs to gently put on a humanitarian hat, and needs to deal with supporting families in the United States who want to help their families. There are charitable organizations that can also be supported.
And so President Biden actually released a statement yesterday expressing support for Cuban citizens. Here's a bit of what he said.
The United States stands firmly with the people of Cuba as they assert their universal rights, and we call on the government of Cuba to refrain from violence or attempts to silence the voice of the people of Cuba.
Now, Eric, you were part of a press conference today calling on the government to lift the embargo. Are you satisfied with the U.S. response so far?
No, not at all satisfied with it. I think that one thing that we're not speaking to at this point is the other voices, the voices of all the Cubans who do support the revolution, of which there are many. Every time I've gone to Cuba, which is multiple times, there are just as many voices, if not more, in favor of their revolution than that are against it. And I think the media tends to focus on these loud voices that are always trying to support the agenda of the United States government, which is to basically overthrow the Cuban government, not allow them to be a sovereign government and make their own decisions. So I'm completely against it. I think that Biden is basically just putting on the suit that Trump made. Trump installed a lot more restrictions, sanctions against Cuba, and instead of going back to the way that Obama was opening relations and relaxing and trying to respect more of a proper relationship with Cuba. No, Biden is just enacting what Trump put into place. And so, no, that's not going to be helpful at all.
And I'm going to jump in. I'm going to give Alberto Cole the last word here. Briefly, in just a few seconds, what, Alberto, do you think these protests mean for the future of Cuba?
The protests mean that there's a whole new generation in Cuba, most of whom, by the way, want change on the island. And they want peaceful change. They want peaceful change. And they
Not the kind of change you're talking about.
And they want a system in which people can disagree peacefully without being arrested for having a placard opposing the government. And they want a system in which, of course, they can preserve a social safety net and also have economic freedom to pursue their own dreams. And that is the root of why such a large percentage of young Cubans want to leave, including, as I said, I know members of the Communist Party, senior government officials, whose children are living in Europe, in the United States, in the United Kingdom.
This is obviously, sorry to interrupt, we're actually out of time, but this is obviously something that's very personal to all of you, something that you're passionate about, something to keep an eye on. But for now, my thanks to the three of you, Eric Torres, Alvaro Cole, and Maria de los Angeles Torres, for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
And we're back to wrap things up right after this. And that's our show for this Tuesday night.
Please join us tomorrow night live at 7. Stigmas surrounding mental health in Latino communities, how some are breaking cultural barriers.
And theater critic Hetty Weiss is back with a look at outdoor dance and music offerings. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Brandis Friedman.
And I'm Paris Schutz. Thank you so much for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm named on the 2021 expertise list of the best personal injury attorneys in Chicago.